Not asking any questions. No. Okay, Sergio, I'm on now, very clearly. Okay, so, um, you like the good sister's permanent record?
Okay, everybody, I think we'll get started. For those here and those who are joining us online as well, thank you for being here, and welcome to our first really presentation for our adult faith development series, and the next one is scheduled for January, and we're still trying to figure out how that might happen. But anyway, this is the first one. We're happy to have with us our other pastor in town. We're happy to have Friar Tim Kulbicki with us. He is a conventual Franciscan friar and the pastor and campus minister at the Newman Student Center here in Chapel Hill. And Friar Tim received his religious and his priesthood formation at his order's seminaries in Maryland and Massachusetts and Rome. As well, he completed his doctorate in ecclesiastical history at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and served for 16 years as a teacher, a formator, and administrator at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore. And he has been here in Chapel Hill for about a year now, a little bit over a year, after serving for 6 years on the staff at his order's general headquarters in Rome. So please join me in welcoming Friar Tim this evening.
Thank you all very much. Father Scott asked me for a keynote, and I asked him what the basic thrust of everything was, and the basic thrust of it is evangelization. So, this evening, reading and responding to the signs of the times. What I'll do is I'll kind of go through the whole thing, and it will be fairly heavy and meaty. You have copies of the PowerPoint already. They will be available as well online afterwards for everyone who is out there in TV land following us along. When we talk about the signs of the times, it's an important piece, important theological point to keep in mind. It really goes back to the Second Vatican Council and the document Gaudium et Spes, which literally translates as joy and hope. And it starts, the joys and the hopes, the griefs and the anxieties of the people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. So this anchors us firmly in the world. And then right in paragraph 4, to carry out the task of proclaiming the gospel in this world, the church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and of interpreting them in the light of the gospel. Now, those of you of a certain age might remember that the 60s were incredibly optimistic, and the 70s were incredibly optimistic, and the 80s a little less so, the 90s a little less so, and the new millennium decidedly less so. And frankly, many good-hearted people got a tad freaked out with reading the signs of the times, such that in 2012, the International Theological Commission, which is a theological think tank of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, issued a document called Theology Today, Perspective, Principles, and Criteria. And it says this: recent centuries have seen major social and cultural developments. The French Revolution, the Enlightenment, emancipation, promotion of women's rights, peace and justice, liberation, democratization, and the ecological movement. Very commonly, people of faith looked at all of this as if it was the enemy. And in some quarters, people actually kind of armored up because the signs of the times did not seem particularly promising for the gospel. This document, number 55, clearly says, such attitudes have gradually changed. That is, we recognize that the gospel is always incarnate in a particular time and space and culture. And if we really have faith in the power of Jesus Christ, then we frankly have to have faith that his gospel has an inroads in the culture in which we find ourselves. Otherwise, the crucifixion and the resurrection didn't work, and the negative culture wins. The clear sight of prophetic individuals and the patient dialogue of theologians, a better discernment in the light of the Gospels has been made. And that's really what our job is. We look at some of the trends around us in the United States. Most of them are not particularly positive. But yet, this calls us to hope. And hope is a word I'm going to keep coming back to. Do not confuse hope with optimism. Optimism is the belief that things are going to get better. Hope is the belief that God has it all in hand. Those are two very, very different things. Now, as we read and respond to the signs of the times, I'm a historian, so I always got to give you a context. So the context that I'm going to give you is what American Catholic historians would refer to as the creation of a coherent Catholic subculture. It begins with mass immigration in about the year 1830, and this creation continues up through until about the year 1920 or so. So what did that look like? First and foremost, the task of welcoming immigrants. We are an immigrant church. So all of the Irish and the Germans, and then later the Poles, the Italians, and all the various Slavic groups that all came over here, and then later on the Hispanic and the Asian Catholics of this time. All of this has been our job to welcome that, to assimilate all of these people, to make of a hodgepodge of ethnicities one Catholic Church in the United States, which ultimately means Americanizing. Now, in American Catholic Church, I'm confused. There we are. Okay. In American Catholic Church history, the argument has never been, should we Americanize the immigrants? But the argument is always, how fast? How fast, how slow? How much do we keep things in native languages? How much do we try to anglicize more and more? We did this in the United States with a heavy investment in institutional structures. Not as much in North Carolina, which until 20 years ago has been a mission church, but in the Northeast and in the upper Midwest, we built these great citadels of large, massive Catholic parishes. Kind of great big ethnic rock piles of massive churches, massive schools, massive convents, massive rectories, massive halls, bowling alleys, boxing rings, the whole thing, because what we were trying to do was to create an enclave. We were trying to create a safe place for all of these immigrants. And we did that in these large cities. We also did this in any number of small towns in the upper Midwest, through Pennsylvania, in the Northeast, in New England. We created these large things as this buffer zone, as this safe zone. Why? Ultimately, to protect the faith of the immigrant, so they would not get lost in a hugely American, mostly Protestant culture. Now, in addition to the ecclesial institutions, we did this with a broad commitment to Catholic education. Already in the 19th century, we did this with parochial primary schools. How many of us here in this room are alumni of a Catholic grade school? Okay. In the early part of the 20th century, the church expanded to found Catholic secondary schools, Catholic high schools. How many of us are alumni of Catholic high schools? Notice the number gets a little smaller. And then in the latter part of the 20th century, very commonly after the Second World War, it's the foundation of lots of Catholic colleges. And how many of us are alumni of Catholic colleges? Okay. In addition, those of you of a certain age, in the United States, we created a particular catechism that was okayed by the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore and hence got known as the Baltimore Catechism. And that created a very common worldview of all American Catholics because we all had this drilled into us by the nuns. So most people of a certain age, when I say you, who made you? God made me. Why did God make you? It created this great big unified worldview. In addition, we founded Catholic hospitals, Catholic social assistance agencies, Catholic nursing homes, Catholic orphanages, Catholic special needs children's schools, etc., etc., etc. Above and beyond that, we also founded fraternal organizations like the Knights of Columbus, like the Catholic War Veterans, like Catholic Ladies Bowling Leagues, and any kind of professional association. Believe it or not, I love to cite this one, every professional association had a Catholic counterpart to it. So in the 1930s and 1940s, there was a National Association of Catholic Library Technicians. As if the library technicians would have their faith tested by going with a Protestant library technician. But this is the worldview, okay? This is the worldview. This continued until the 1920s, and it reigned supreme until after the Second World War. After the Second World War, we began to see this dissolving. Why? Basically because all of the blue-collar American Catholic ethnic men that went to serve their country in the military got the GI Bill of Rights. And then they came home, got themselves a nice bachelor's degree, and moved, as they say in Baltimore, out the road. They just went out to the suburbs. And this first ring of suburbs was still a very Catholic ring of suburbs, but it was no longer ethnic. It was a little bit more homogenized. And certain things contributed to a buildup of our sense of being individuals. Most people didn't have public transportation. Everybody got into their Studebaker or Ford or Chevy alone. No longer were people sitting on front stoops on row houses. Many houses didn't even have porches. Everything was detached. And you came in, and air conditioning fostered this whole sense of being an individual. American Catholics began to grow out of the blue-collar working class and much more into the middle, if not upper middle class. And slowly but surely, we as American Catholics assimilated very much into American culture. But it's a fascinating phenomenon. The 1950s is when we also start, I think unconsciously we began to feel a little bit threatened by all of this, that we began to insist on visible markers. If you go through a 1950s suburb in the Northeast, you will very commonly find what I jokingly call on the front lawns, Our Lady of the Bathtub. And it's usually a statue of the Blessed Mother in a half bathtub, kind of a little shell, and it was a sign of piety. But above and beyond being a sign of piety, this marked off a Catholic house. And Catholic households were told, you must have a crucifix in every room to mark it off. Very commonly, when you got married in the 50s, one of your wedding gifts would have been a crucifix, a thick one, when you opened it up, inside you had a sick call kit. Very, very Catholic. These were visible identity markers. This is also the time, for example, when there was a great promotion to wearing of the miraculous medal or a scapular. And again, think about it. When you're in gym class in Clarksville Public High School, and you look around in the locker room and who's wearing a miraculous medal and who's wearing a scapular, you figure out who the Catholic kids are. There's a lot of this notion of a visible kind of a Catholic identity. But more and more, this subculture was starting to come apart. Now, you will meet any number of Catholics who will say, well, all of the negativity is a result of the Second Vatican Council. They fall into the logical fallacy of what is called post hoc ergo propter hoc. It happened after this, therefore it happens because of this. And in reality, this dissolution of the Catholic subculture in the United States was coincidental with the Second Vatican Council. Moreover, it was coincidental with another American factor. Periods in the United States, there are some periods that have been extremely religious, like the 1930s and the 1950s, and other periods that were extremely not religious, the 1920s and the 1960s. So this happened to fall into an ebb period of American religion, the dissolution of this culture, and the Second Vatican Council all happened at the same time. What this left us with is age cohorts. What we might call the World War II generation, which is essentially anyone around the age of 80 and above. These are your highly religious people. These are the people who were formed completely in this Catholic subculture and have a very Catholic view. These are the people who disproportionately continue to show up in our churches. Incidentally, these are also the people who disproportionately contribute to the maintenance of our churches. They are completely a product of this huge Catholic worldview. Their children would be me, baby boomers. Adults, when you come of age around 1960, 1970. People around 60 to 75 years of age. We are somewhat religious, but we're not as stooped in this subculture as our parents are or were. We consider ourselves a little bit more spiritual and not quite as religious. The subculture was dissolving around us, and what we knew was Vatican II and the cultural 70s. And in some cases, the religious education that we received in those periods was not quite adequate. This is the stuff that is typically caricatured as balloons and collages instead of sound Catholic doctrine, for good or for bad. Generation X, these would be people who came in their adulthood in the 80s. This generation is more conventionally religious. They also tend to be very conservative and on the conservative end. Why? The two major figures in the 1980s were Ronald Reagan and John Paul II, both of whom strongly represented a certain brand and a certain way to look at the world. The fourth generation is what we call the millennials. These are the people under 40. They are even less religious. They are less willing to identify with religion, period. It's not merely a Catholic problem, it is an American issue. The exception within Catholicism are those extremely fervent, that are sometimes called evangelical Catholics, sometimes called John Paul II Catholics. This is the kind of the young seminarian, the young religious woman in a full habit, the young family with 4, 5, 6 children. They are here in our church, but they're not representative of their whole generation. But often, when we look for young people in our church, that's all we see. That's all we see. Now, notice I've already set up some division points. Older people and younger people have very, very different views of religion. Now, in addition to this age issue, there are 3 different stylistic issues that are out there. The first is what we might call mainstream. These are the people that can happily consider themselves both Catholic and American. They're successful, they're Americanized, they're very enculturated. If we might to look at them on a political view, we could say that Joe Biden is one and George Weigel is another, from 2 very different political stripes. This mainstream style has a very long history. It goes back to the first American bishop, John Carroll. It goes back to the arguments over the Americanism and the Americanization of immigrants around the year 1900. This group of Catholics is very much at home in Catholic culture, very much at home in Catholic values. And it tends to assimilate away any Catholic distinctiveness. We don't want to stick out too much. So this is a little bit more of the side of religion should be private. By the way, asking people like this that believe in this way of doing things to go out and evangelize and invite people to come to church and talk about why you love Jesus and why you love the Eucharist is an incredibly difficult task. Because this whole style simply believes that that's a private thing that is me. Now, this American style, this mainstream style, accommodates Catholicism. And again, here let's look at it on the political divide. The Catholic right claims that the Catholic left mainstream style accommodates completely on the issue of abortion and on the issue of gender and sexuality. The Catholic left claims that the Catholic right accommodates completely to American values on the issues of immigration and social justice. And frankly, both are correct. Because this whole tendency is to blend in together. Now, this tendency to blend in together usually has a sincere respect for religious pluralism, which is basically, you worship the way you want to, I worship the way I want to. And it's hard to get a sense of evangelization. The flip side of this as well is, well, you know, my kids have left the church and now they go to Rock Everlasting Church on the Hill. But that's okay because they're still going to church and they still believe in God. Very accommodated. Okay? Generally speaking, this group, their Catholicism is pretty wide. It ain't particularly deep. In many ways, it's still kind of a cultural Catholicism. Now, in addition to this mainstream, there's the whole immigrant style, of which you have a very clear example here in St. Thomas More Parish. The whole wave of immigrants that arrived in this country with the opening of the immigration bill in 1965, which we'll talk down in a little bit down. The immigrant style resists the idea that everything has to be Americanized and enculturated. They're kind of happier with a certain level of ethnic distinctiveness. They are very aware that America is still prejudiced. America is prejudiced about immigrants, and there's a good, strong, stubborn streak of anti-Catholic prejudice. The Jesuit scholar at Fordham University, Mark Massa, called anti-Catholicism, quote, the last socially acceptable American prejudice, unquote. At a cocktail party, you cannot make fun of gay people, blacks, women, people with disabilities, but you can make fun of the Pope and Catholics and get away with that. It's the last socially acceptable prejudice. They may live in a neighborhood, what we might call a ghetto, might be in an enclave, but generally not, unless it's socioeconomically driven. The old traditional thing of America viewing it as a melting pot, they would much rather view all of this as a salad bowl. That is, the salad is there, but the lettuce never becomes a tomato and the tomato never becomes a radish. It all stays distinct, blended together, but very distinct. The immigrants have some ambivalence about American culture. They tend to be more conservative on family issues and gender issues, and they tend to not like where some of American multiculturalism is moving towards. On the other hand, they love being here. They want to be successful here. What they're looking for from the church really is services and resources. Masses in their language, priests that can understand their language, programs that help them out, help with immigration, help with TASOL, help with those kinds of things. That's mainly what they're looking for from the church and also, by the way, from the state. The last of these styles is what we call the evangelical style. There's always been a little bit of this in American Catholicism, but it's much more contemporary. Here, these are people who have either undergone a religious conversion, that is, from some non-Catholic religion or Christian creed to Catholicism, or they have undergone what they call a reversion. I grew up Catholic, I lost the faith in high school, I came back with gangbusters when I was 25. Now, when I was teaching in the seminary, I would ask my typical class, how many of you are either converts or reverts? And half of the seminary would raise its hand. And I would come back to them and say, this is just a phenomenon of your generation. In my seminary class, not a single one of us would have fallen into this category. This is a distinctive area. This category strongly believes that our culture needs to be converted. The real argument is, in what direction? Does it need to be converted away from a culture of death and more towards a culture of life? Or does it need to be converted away from walling out the immigrants to welcoming people who come here? Okay? Is this represented by the nuns on the bus or the Sisters for Life? Both are evangelical. They just appeal to different sections. They tend to be much more publicly counter-cultural. They look for expressions of Catholicism that mark them out as being distinctive. So, for example, this is the return to chapel veils and mantillas among some women in church. Perfectly acceptable, but it marks you out. This is the return to those particularly Catholic signals. A heavy return to Mary, a heavy return to Eucharist and Eucharistic adoration, and a heavy return to the Roman Pontiff, although not so much with the one we have at the moment, for certain elements of this. Since American religion is voluntary, Nobody forces you to go to church. It's not like England, where you're not even expected to be a member of the Church of England, or Sweden, where you're expected to be a member of the Swedish Lutheran Church. Because everything is privatized in our culture around this, you're going to expect that some people are going to take this a little bit more intensely. It's among this element, among some, they are nostalgic for a Catholic subculture that they never really knew. But it just seems so strong and formidable. They never kind of quite ask the question, why did it collapse? And if they do, whispers of Satan in there. As a historian, it collapsed because its time essentially came. Now, we've now got 4 cohorts and 3 styles. Okay? Now let's look at the religious landscape of America. It's both an opportunity and a challenge. America remains highly religious. A high majority still identify with a religion. Approximately 70% identify with the religion. Attendance at religious services is higher here than it is in most of the rest of the developed world. Catholic Mass attendance is still at around 20 to 30%, depending on where you are. In some Catholic countries in Europe, it's about 2 to 5%. So attendance at religious services. The majority of Americans report praying regularly. Although they rarely go to church, many of them, they still report praying regularly. The high majority believe in God. However, religious identity, that I identify at this, no longer translates into showing up in church. It does not translate into religious practice. Now, there are some who have suggested, well, when things get critical enough, people will flock back into church. The statistics do not bear that out. The various crises of the last 20 years have not seen an uptick in religious practice. I would suspect that once we hit to whatever the new normal looks like, our rate of mass attendance, I suspect, will be much lower than it was before. People have simply gotten out of the habit. Now, the role of religion is also gently declining. By the way, I'm drawing all of this out of the Pew Research. If you just Google Pew Research, you'll find all of these studies around. The role of religion is gently declining. The younger one gets, generally the less religious one gets. Furthermore, people who are highly committed to religion, there are less and less and less of them the younger one gets. Now, you might say, well, people get more religious with age because they start facing, the final end, and they start taking this more seriously and they get more religious. That's generally true. However, today's 70 or 80-somethings started at this level of religion, and in their 70s and 80s, they ratcheted up to here. Today's 20-somethings are starting at this level of religion, and if they ratchet it up to there, we'll consider ourselves lucky. Then we have what are called the new nuns. This slang word comes from a typical pollster question. Do you consider yourself Catholic, mainline Protestant, evangelical Protestant, Jew, Muslim? other, or none of the above. 35% of people under the age of 30 check none of the above. 23% of all Americans now consider themselves to have no religion. No religion is now the second largest religion in the United States after Protestantism. Evangelical Protestantism, to be more precise. What is very scary is that in the last 13 years, that percentage has doubled. Hint, under the age of 30 is where we get most of our vocations. If 35% of them no longer believe in Catholicism or identify themselves as Catholics, do you really think they're going to become priests and sisters? Furthermore, if they do not anymore identify themselves as Catholics, do you think they're going to bring their children back to be baptized? This group is morally relativistic. You have your values, I have mine. Don't stick your nose in my bedroom, I won't stick my nose in your bedroom. Don't stick your nose in my wallet, I won't stick my nose in your wallet. Morally relativistic. Highly self-defining. Whenever I have to deal with UNC and any kind of a thing in UNC, the fad at the moment is to put your name. So I would put Friar Tim, and then the next line, I would put he, him. In other words, I'm Friar Tim, I'm a male, and I actually identify as a male. I could identify myself, if I wanted to, as an Asian lesbian. And I have a perfect right to do that. Why? Because I define myself. There are no norms. These two things together raise the real question. How do we talk about moral issues here? Because the second we start talking about moral issues, these people are going to walk, even if they're vaguely interested in something about religion. They're not unbelievers. While there are some percentage of kind of new atheists or new agnostic, they're not unbelievers. They're just disengaged from formal religion. They're a species of what Robert Bellah, 30 years ago, called expressive individualism. That is, my religion is my small little voice telling me what is good for me to do. These are the spiritual and not religious. Now, the next question of reading American culture. America is tremendously fluid in its religious identification. A plurality of Americans, approximately 40%, switch religions at least once in their life. Any of you here work on an RCIA team? And I'm sure, Jim, you have seen people come in and say, well, you know, I was raised a Baptist, then I became a Unitarian, and I tried Judaism for a while, but I didn't really like that. And then I practiced a little bit of Buddhism, and then I came back to being an Episcopalian, but now I want to be a Catholic. It's yeah. Okay? Now, this is the path. By the way, this is a great opportunity, because if we are really open to working with these people, there is a spiritual hunger out there, but it requires a great level of patience and a great level of tact to begin to differentiate who are the religiously curious from the religiously open. This is particularly marked among Caucasians. The majority of white Catholics are no longer practicing. About half of the crowd that is no longer practicing no longer even identify as Catholic. 20 years ago, they used to say, I'm a lapsed Catholic or a fallen Catholic. Huh? Recovering Catholic. Now they say, I was a Catholic. I'm an ex-Catholic. They no longer identify. To our shame, the worst religion in the United States for retaining people is the Roman Catholic Church, statistically. Notwithstanding how many people come through our RCIA program every year. We are the worst at retaining. Yet, about 20% of the population still identifies itself as Catholic, which is a good thing. And that's the people we got to work with. One more point in terms of the great diversity of stuff we find ourselves with. There's a shifting racial ethnic mix. Again, as I pointed out, 1965, the ending of immigration quotas and more open immigration into the United States. Currently, 35 to 40% of American Catholics are Latino. 58%, according to Pew, of Catholics under the age of 35 are Latino. The Latinos are still having children. The white folk, not so much. There are also substantial numbers of Asian and African immigrants. Every Catholic parish that I've ever been to has a small but very sustained core of Filipino Catholics. The Koreans and the Vietnamese often remain in ethnic parishes, but the Filipinos assimilate very quickly. There are also a number of parishes that have a very strong presence of African Catholics, often Nigerian, which is the largest country in Africa, some Kenyan and Cameroonian, but very commonly Nigerian. All of these immigrants are more highly religious than white folk in the United States. And it is very likely that very quickly U.S. Catholicism will be a majority-minority religion in terms of race. Very likely in the very near future. Now, as we're reading the signs of the times, there are three major contrasting interpretations or responses to this. The first is what I might call the liberal professoriate, which is the reason why nobody's coming to church is because church teaching is too rigid regarding human sexuality and the role of women. If we just loosened all of these things up, people would come back in droves. The problem with that is mainline Protestantism loosened all of that up, and they're in worse shape than we are. The second is generally associated with the figure of Pope Benedict, and in the United States, frankly, with the figure of Bishop Robert Barron, the auxiliary bishop of Los Angeles, with his Word on Fire Institute. We're in a hostile culture to religion. Relativistic, as we pointed out, consumerist, and scientistic. Everything has to be factual. And we've done a very poor job in educating our young people, and therefore they drift away. While I think there's some validity to this, the thing that frightens me is the old-fashioned stories of ugly American tourists going overseas. Ugly American tourists think that if they just speak louder and slower, the Italians will understand me. Of course, it doesn't happen. So while clear, effective catechesis is always important, I'm not quite so sure it's the silver bullet that's going to solve all our problems. What makes more sense to me is this third point. We're in the midst of a major global change regarding religion. They call this the second axial age. The first axial age was in the 500 or so years before Christ, which produced the great Hebrew prophets, Jesus Christ, Buddha, and the early Hindu teachings. Not bad for religious innovation. This would call religions to pay much more attention to the person. It's not for nothing that one of the principal terms associated with Pope Francis is the word encounter. It's not enough to just blather about the gospel from the pulpit. I have to encounter and accompany somebody. Second, religions need to pay much more attention to our embodied existence on earth. The whole old-fashioned thing of promising pie in the sky when you die doesn't convince anybody anymore. Again, it's not for nothing that one of the major encyclicals of Pope Francis is Laudato Si, a sustained reflection on what it means to be an embodied creature on Mother Earth. Third, religions need to find much more common ground among themselves. That is, fighting between Catholics and Protestants, or between Christians and Muslims, they're not the enemy. The enemy is secularization. And we do much better off if we find common ground. So again, in my opinion, it's not for nothing that Francis's latest encyclical talks about universal brotherhood, fratelli tutti. Now, responding to the signs of the times. Historically, institutions have been our American Catholic answer, as I pointed out before. Parishes, schools. Build more parishes, build more schools. However, we're in a period of institutional diminishment. The number of parishes has declined 12.5% since its high point. The number of priests has declined 38.7% since its high point. The number of elementary schools declined 40%. The number of secondary schools, 26%. The priest population is also aging. I am 62 years old, and I'm a campus minister. Think about that. Think about that. Think about the fact that St. Thomas More has over 3,000 families, is bilingual, and you have one priest. Now, the positive side of all of this is the huge growth in lay ecclesial ministers. That is, well-trained people, either with academic degrees or with good certifications, that work willingly for the church, often for not great wages. Can I tell you the truth? Often for not great wages. And often with very little job security, because you're always at the whim of the next pastor. All right? That's just, but in many ways, that's the backbone. The second backbone is permanent deacons. These two groups have in many ways taken up a lot of the institutional support. So, if we now talk about the work of evangelizing, you can't expect Father Scott to do it. You just can't. He's got a multi-million-dollar business to run here. And how many staff? 30 or 40? Plus a school? He can't. The work of evangelization falls mainly to the baptized. Now, your task, you're going to be guided and supported by lay ecclesial ministers and deacons. And you're going to be inspired, hopefully, by Father Scott and your priests. But the work's got to fall to you. There's really no way around it. Some practical hints. Some practical hints. First, be objective. When you read the signs of the times, don't cook the books. In other words, don't make the signs of the times respond to your own particular pet project. So, for example, Father, I like the Latin Mass, and when I go to the Latin Mass, I see lots of young families with lots of young children. If we had Latin Masses here, many more people would come. Not so sure. Maybe. But did you actually ask any of those people that, did you drift away from the Catholic Church because it wasn't in Latin? So don't cook the books. Be objective. Second, be aware of your own fear and anxiety. I'm told that the single most used word in the New Testament is variations on the word fear. It is not love. That we are afraid and anxious is something that Jesus understood. And if we don't be aware of our own fear and anxiety, it paralyzes us, it keeps us locked in our heads, and it just causes us to close the doors and sit quietly with me and my Jesus. Third, avoid the tendency to blame. Don't blame the bishops, don't blame the priests, don't blame Vatican II, don't blame the sisters who don't wear habits, don't blame poor catechesis. It's wasted energy. It is what it is. So don't waste energy on blaming. It's just purely wasted energy. Be broad in your thinking. Many times, we're very binary, this or that, either or. And most of the times, it's better off to go both and, which, by the way, is the classic Catholic response. Catholicism is almost never either or. It's almost always both and. Be strategic. And here I'm stealing something from Bob Barrett. If the great philosophicals of the beautiful, the good, and the true are all true, lead with the beautiful. Lead with good liturgy. Lead with good music. Lead with good liturgical art. Lead with the lives of the saints and the beauty of people who sacrifice themselves. Lead with that. Don't lead with condemnations of homosexuality, premarital sex, or anything else having to do with it. Don't lead with that. Don't lead with, well, Catholic teaching on this is correct and Protestant teaching on this is... Don't lead with that. Eventually it'll come up. But don't lead. Lead with the beautiful. The beautiful is attractive. Okay? The beautiful is attractive. Be hopeful. God does have it worked out. That will lead you with some optimism. But be hopeful that God has it worked out. Increase our faith. I firmly believe that one of the issues around the question of secularization in the world is those of us who still continue to come to church and wear habits and collars. I question how much we really do believe all of this. I think we're really dealing with a crisis of our own faith. How much do we really believe in what the church teaches? How much do we really have a faith that is nourished by a sustained and sustaining relationship with Jesus Christ? This is my worry with the COVID shutdowns, that if people's only way to approach Jesus Christ was through the Eucharist, And they couldn't do that for 3 to 6 months, depending on where they are. They simply don't know how to be in a sustained relationship with Jesus Christ. I'd like to leave you with a few pithy quotes from Pope Francis's Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. I think they give us good hints for how to evangelize in this world whose not so good stuff we've just kind of read in the signs of the times. The first thing, you have to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. Number 3, I invite all Christians everywhere at this very moment to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ, or at least an openness to letting him encounter them. I ask all of you to do this unfailingly each day. It simply is no longer enough to show up on Sundays, drop your envelope off, and pretend that life is like getting into a great big fat inner tube in the lazy river at the water park. It's just not going to take you anywhere. A renewed discipleship in Jesus Christ. Number 12, remember, this is God's work. Jesus is the first and greatest evangelizer. In every activity of evangelization, the primacy always belongs to God. So here, we can go to evangelization classes, we can have evangelization programs, we can have evangelization tactics and strategies, and all of these things are good. But if we're not rooted in this faith in Jesus Christ, it all becomes marketing. Marketing is not evangelization. The primacy belongs to God, who has called us to cooperate with him and who leads us on by the power of the Spirit. Third, get involved with other people's lives. Encounter. Meet people where they are. 24. Let us try a little harder to take the first step and to become involved. Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. The Lord gets involved, and he involves his own as he kneels to wash their feet. An evangelizing community gets involved in people's daily lives. It bridges distances. Number 24, be patient with the task. An evangelizing community is supportive, standing by people at every step of the way, no matter how difficult or lengthy this may prove to be. It is familiar with patient expectation and apostolic endurance. Quote, evangelization consists mostly of patience and disregards the constraints of time. Finally, mission, not maintenance. While we need to maintain our buildings, we need to maintain the staff, we need to maintain these things, we need to maintain the school, those are all clear. But if maintenance becomes the major thing, we become self-centered. Number 27, I dream of a missionary option capable of transforming everything so that the church's customs, ways of doing things, times and schedules, language and structure can be suitably challenged for the evangelization of today's world, not for our self-preservation. Brothers and sisters, we have a huge task. I hope I've given you some tools to read these signs of the times and respond to them, and I hope you all have a very good year in terms of adult faith formation. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Am I on? Nope. No. Okay. Friar Tim, thank you very much for a very informative presentation tonight, for providing clarity about how we've been shaped historically in terms of our Catholic subculture, competing styles of American Catholicism, and an ever-changing religious landscape. Evangelization and disciple-making is the collective work of all of us who are baptized. So thank you for giving us hope in reading the signs of the times and help to respond with patient, faith-filled, and joyful engagement in people's lives as Christ has taught us. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to those who are watching from home. And I'd like to end with a reflection that is based on Evangelii Gaudium. The Word of God consistently shows us how God challenges those who believe in Him to go forth. In our day, Jesus' command to go and make disciples echoes on the changing scenarios and ever new challenges to Jesus' mission of evangelization. And all of us are called to take part in this new missionary going forth. Before all else, the gospel invites us to respond to the love of God who saves us, to see God in others, and to go forth from ourselves to seek the good of others. Let us join in prayer in praise to the Trinity. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Good night. Good night. Thank you.